I'm Nima Rajan. Not all provinces have reported their COVID-19 vaccination data from the Victoria Day holiday, but of those that did, more than 112,000 more shots were put into Canadian arms Monday. That's a total of more than 21.1 million shots given so far, and more than 50% of Canadians at least partially immunized against the virus. More provinces have stepped up to expand vaccinations to younger age groups. Ontario has opened Pfizer vaccine appointments to kids 12 and over through the province's online booking system. Quebec will officially open its online booking system to anyone aged 12 and up today as well. Only about 600,000 doses of the Pfizer-BioNTech COVID-19 vaccine are set to arrive in Canada this week. The two pharmaceutical firms shipped 1.4 million doses ahead of schedule last week in anticipation of the May long weekend. Other vaccine makers have struggled to keep their shipments flowing. The federal government is not expecting any more doses of the Moderna vaccine before the end of this month. Meanwhile, Health Canada is still reviewing 300,000 vaccines from Johnson & Johnson that were delivered last month. Parts of Canada have moved to loosen restrictions as their regional COVID-19 situations continue to trend downward and show signs of improvement. Quebec lifted the last remaining emergency lockdown measures imposed on southern hotspots yesterday, meaning non-essential businesses can reopen and the evening curfew will be pushed back to 9:30. Saskatchewan will begin to relax capacity limits on retail, personal care services, and restaurants June 20th, now that 70% of residents 30 and up have been vaccinated with at least one dose. Most of Alberta's students will return to in-person learning today after they were switched to 2 weeks online to stem a surge in hospital admissions. Yukon's government will lift several restrictions today, including allowing groups of up to 200 people to gather inside and outside. Canadian military personnel have come forward in droves to be vaccinated for COVID-19. The Department of National Defence reports that more than 85% of all troops have received at least one dose. That's a contrast to the U.S., where some reports suggest as many as 1/3 of American troops have declined to get a shot. Defense Department spokesman Daniel Lebouthillier says the majority of unvaccinated Canadian service members haven't declined to get a jab, they just haven't had an opportunity to do so. Some Canadian Italians of Italian origin say Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's pending apology for the internment of people of Italian origin during the Second World War is long overdue. Mr. Trudeau is set to deliver a formal apology in the House of Commons on Thursday. Montreal historian Joyce Pilarella says it offers her family and others the moral justice they have been waiting for. She says Italian-Canadian families were stigmatized as state enemies and had to battle to survive. U.S. President Joe Biden has signed into law legislation that opens a door to resumed cruise ship travel to Alaska after the pandemic last year scrapped sailings. The measure, signed yesterday, will allow large cruise ships to sail directly from Washington state to Alaska without stopping in Canada. It is intended as a temporary workaround of a long-standing federal law that requires large cruise ships bound for Alaska to stop in Canada or start trips there. Amid COVID-19 concerns, Canada has barred cruise operations through February. Members of Alaska's congressional delegation pushed for the workaround. More airwaves are being set aside for 5G cellular technology as the Canadian government says it will auction off a repurposed wireless spectrum band. The Ministry of Innovation, Science and Economic Development said the 3,800 megahertz band is key for 5G. An auction for the band is scheduled to take place in 2023. Another key spectrum band, 3,500, is scheduled to be auctioned on June 15th. A former Chadian ambassador to Canada says the U.S. is facing bribery and money laundering charges allegedly involving a Canadian energy startup company. The U.S. Justice Department alleges a $2 million bribe was solicited from the unnamed company before the payment was laundered in the U.S. financial system to hide its true nature. The bribe is alleged to have been in exchange for help obtaining oil rights in Chad. Recruitment agencies and workers say employers need to ensure they stamp out unhealthy work practices as the COVID-19 pandemic drags on. Experts say promoting a healthy work environment means fewer employees leave for another company or change careers altogether. A survey by recruitment agency Robert Half found that 62% of respondents say the pandemic has made them feel stuck on career advancement and salary growth. All right, more top national headlines coming your way after the break. More on Canada's fight against COVID-19 as the Yukon Territory lifts some restrictions. Meanwhile, another handful of protesters were arrested in BC for demonstrating against old-growth logging. And Quebec opens COVID-19 vaccinations for kids over 12 years old. Stay tuned for these stories and more news from around the world coming up today on the Forum Daily. We'll be right back, everyone. Restrictions put in place at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic are set to lift in Yukon today, paving the way for crowds to gather both in and outdoors. Starting today, those who are fully vaccinated won't need to isolate for 2 weeks when they travel to the territory. Social bubbles will increase to 20 people, bars and restaurants can return to full capacity, and weddings, funerals, and religious services can increase to 200 people. Another handful of protesters have been arrested on southern Vancouver Island at demonstrations against old-growth logging. The RCMP say 3 of the 5 arrested will be facing civil contempt of court charges, while the other 2 face obstruction charges. In total, 53 people have been arrested since an injunction against the protests started to be enforced last week. Activists say they are there because very little of the best old-growth forest remains in the province. Most of Alberta's students will return to in-person learning today. Students have been attending classes online since May 7th, when the government ordered all kindergarten to grade 12 students to be sent home for 2 weeks. Education Minister Adriana LaGrange said in a news release last week that the 2-week plan has been successful in nearly all areas of the province, and she's confident all students will finish the remainder of the school year in the classroom. Well, meanwhile, Alberta's advanced education minister wants the province's universities to pause their pursuit of new or renewed partnerships with organizations linked with China or the Chinese Communist Party. Dimitrios Nicolaides says he's deeply concerned about the potential theft of Canadian intellectual property. He says he's also worried that research partnerships with the People's Republic of China may be used by Chinese military and intelligence agencies. An official with the Blackfeet tribe in Montana says vaccination clinics at the Canada-United States border in southwestern Alberta have come to an end. The Blackfeet began offering shots of the Pfizer-BioNTech and Moderna vaccines at the Carway border crossing a month ago, initially to just members of the Blackfoot Confederacy, but later for anyone who wanted them. U.S. Customs and Border Protection said last week Canadians attempting to drive across the American border solely for a COVID-19 vaccination would be denied entry. Saskatchewan says it has reached the Step 2 threshold on the province's reopening roadmap, with over 70% of residents aged 30 and older having received their first dose of COVID-19 vaccine. Starting June 20th, capacity thresholds on retail, personal care services, restaurants, and bars will be eased. Among other restrictions that will loosen, 15 people will be allowed at private indoor gatherings, and 150 will be permitted at public indoor gatherings and private and public outdoor gatherings. Ottawa has announced it will send health workers and other supports to Manitoba as it grapples with high COVID-19 rates and overburdened intensive care units. The federal government says it will also provide medical staff through the Canadian Red Cross as well as military help. It's also prepared to deploy epidemiologists, lab technicians, and other supports. Manitoba Premier Brian Pallister asked for help after speaking with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau on Friday. Ontario residents who received a first dose of the Oxford AstraZeneca COVID-19 vaccine in mid-March will be able to book their second shot this week. Ontario's top doctors said last week those who got their first jab of AstraZeneca between March 10th and March 19th during a pilot project at some pharmacies and doctors' offices will be prioritized for the second dose. Though the recommended interval between shots is at least 12 weeks, the second injection is being offered to that group after 10 weeks to make use of 45,000 doses set to expire within days. All Quebecers aged 12 and up can now book a COVID-19 vaccine through the province's online portal. While some kids between the ages of 12 and 17 were able to get vaccinated at walk-in clinics over the weekend, as of today, they are able to make appointments through the online booking system. Health Minister Christian Dubé said last week that teens will also be able to get vaccinated through their schools on the weeks of June 7th and 14th. Officials in Newfoundland and Labrador are imposing the second highest COVID-19 alert level.
Our next course of action is to expand restrictions where there is an increased risk of transmission. We are finding more contacts and positive cases associated with this outbreak outside of the communities currently under alert level 4. And as a result, effective immediately, all communities along the TCH Route 1 from Gambo to Badger will move to alert level 4, as well as communities along highway routes 320, 330, 340, and 350, and most of the branches of these routes. And these routes are delineated in the special measures order, which will be posted.
The restriction covers a larger area of the province as they try to curb a growing cluster of infections. All right, up next, we take a look at what's making news south of the border as the U.S. Secretary of State begins his Middle East tour. Meanwhile, the CDC warns Americans against travel to Tokyo. Stay with us. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has vowed to rally international support to aid Gaza during a visit today to Israel. He arrived in the country this morning to begin a regional tour to shore up last week's ceasefire that has so far held between Israel and the Palestinians. After meeting with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Mr. Blinken said the U.S. would work to address the grave humanitarian situation in the coastal territory of Gaza. But he said it will also work to ensure that Gaza's militant Hamas rulers do not benefit from reconstruction assistance. The U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the State Department are warning Americans against all travel to Japan. They cite concerns about a surge in COVID-19 cases as the country prepares to host the Olympics in just 2 months. The twin alerts don't ban U.S. citizens from visiting the country. They may factor into decisions by Olympic athletes and spectators on whether to compete in or attend the Games, which are due to start in July. As Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and British Columbia continue to ramp up preparations for what is expected to be a busy fire season, scientists in the U.S. say the outlook in the American West is grim. U.S. officials say from the Rockies westward to the Pacific, April was the second driest on record, and the mega drought was likely fueled by climate change. The tinderbox conditions mean soil and plants are much drier, making trees and brush more likely to ignite and fire to spread. Republican Florida Governor Ron DeSantis has signed into law a bill that would punish social media platforms that remove conservative ideas from their sites. The new law will let Florida fine large social media companies $250,000 a day if they remove an account of a statewide political candidate. It's unclear whether the new law can stand a constitutional challenge since it might violate the First Amendment. Puerto Rico has ended a nightly pandemic curfew after more than a year in force and will allow vaccinated visitors to enter the island without a negative coronavirus test result. The island has been under a curfew since March 2020, when the first coronavirus case was reported. Arriving visitors who are not vaccinated will still be required to present a negative coronavirus test or promise to offer a test result within 48 hours. The government intends to impose a $300 fine to those who don't comply with the testing. A Russian man has been sentenced to what amounts to time served after pleading guilty to trying to bribe someone to get corporate secrets from Tesla. Igor Igorovich Kryuchkov has admitted to trying to pay a Tesla employee $500,000 to install computer malware at Tesla's electric battery plant in Nevada, with the goal of stealing company secrets for ransom. During a video conference from jail, the suspect apologized. Federal prosecutors say the attempt hack was unsuccessful and Tesla network wasn't compromised. The Associated Press is renewing its rules about social media use by its workers after questions were raised about the firing of a journalist who had expressed pro-Palestinian views. More than 100 AP journalists signed a letter expressing concern about how the company treated Emily Wilder. The former news associate was fired last week for expressing support online for the Palestinian cause. The letter from AP journalists sought more clarity from the company about what can be said in online forums like Twitter and Facebook. As more private companies start selling tickets to space, a new question looms. Who gets to call themselves an astronaut? It's already a complicated issue and about to get much more so as the wealthy purchase spacecraft seats. Retired NASA astronaut Mike Mullane finds it a meaningless title until liftoff. He also points out that it isn't a copyrighted word, so anybody can call themselves an astronaut whether they've gone to space or not. A new analysis by the Congressional Budget Office says operating and modernizing U.S. nuclear forces is likely to cost $634 billion over the coming decade. That includes tens of billions more than previously foreseen to operate nuclear-armed submarines and to update Energy Department nuclear weapons laboratories and production facilities. The extent of President Joe Biden's commitment to the nuclear modernization program may be reflected in the 2022 budget that he will send to Congress on Friday. Mexican officials say gunmen ambushed the director of state police in the cartel-plagued northern state of Sinaloa and killed him. The state public safety secretary said Monday that Joel Ernesto Soto was found dead in his bullet-riddled car on a highway near the state capital, Culiacan. Mr. Soto was an Army lieutenant colonel who was on leave while heading to the state police. Sinaloa is home to the cartel of the same name. The cartel has been riven by internal differences and is also engaged in turf battles with the Jalisco cartel. All right, stay with us as we take a look at more top stories from around the world as China defends against more allegations of a genocide in the country's Xinjiang region. Meanwhile, Japan reacts to a U.S. warning against traveling to the Tokyo Olympics. These stories and more news from around the world coming up next on Forum Daily. China is denouncing plans for a people's tribunal in Britain on allegations of genocide against Uyghurs and other Muslims in China's Xinjiang region. A spokesman for the region's government says China has condemned and despised the hearings, which are expected to draw dozens of witnesses when they begin in early June. China is accused of locking up more than 1 million Uyghurs and members of other minority groups in re-education camps, where they are forced to denounce their traditional culture and swear fealty to China's ruling Communist Party. Tokyo was quick to deny that a U.S. warning for Americans to avoid traveling to Japan would have any impact on Olympians. Japan is determined to hold the already pandemic-delayed Tokyo Games starting July 23rd. The U.S. cited a surge in coronavirus cases in Japan caused by virus variants that may even pose a risk to vaccinated people. Japan's government said it believes Washington supports Tokyo's effort to hold the Olympics. The African Union and United Nations say mutinous soldiers have arrested Mali's transitional president and prime minister and taken them to military headquarters. The development came just hours after a government reshuffle left out 2 members of the junta that seized power in a coup 9 months earlier. The joint statement by the AU, UN, and the West African Regional Bloc calls for the immediate release of President Ba Danao and Prime Minister Mokhtar Ouane. Mali's transitional government was sworn in last September and is tasked with organizing new elections by February. A collision of light rail trains in a tunnel in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, has injured more than 200 people. The transport minister said a metro train carrying passengers collided with a vacant carriage on a test run near the Petronas Towers. Police suspect a miscommunication from the Operation Control Center occurred. The center was in control of the train carrying passengers, while the vacant carriage had a driver. Train services resumed on Tuesday morning. The UN Special Envoy for Myanmar is warning of possible civil war in the country. Christine Schreiner-Bergener says people are arming themselves against the military junta and protesters are shifting from defensive to offensive actions, using homemade weapons and training from some ethnic armed groups. She told a virtual UN news conference on Monday that people are starting self-defense actions because they are frustrated and fear attacks by the military. To try to avoid civil war, she said she has been discussing the idea of starting an inclusive dialogue with all parties. European Union leaders have agreed on a set of sanctions against Belarus, including banning its airlines from using the airspace and airports of the 27-nation bloc. The action comes amid fury over the forced diversion of a passenger jet flying between 2 EU countries in order to arrest an opposition journalist. In what EU leaders have called a brazen hijacking of Irish carrier Ryanair's plane, they demanded the immediate release of Roman Protasevich, a key foe of authoritarian Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko. The UN Security Council has condemned killings and attacks against UN peacekeepers in the strongest terms and is calling for prompt prosecution of those responsible. It said Secretary General Antonio Guterres and countries contributing troops and police to peacekeeping operations should work together to ensure that peacekeepers have adequate resources and training to mitigate threats, including from landmines and improvised explosive devices. The presidential statement was approved today at an open council meeting. Hong Kong leader Carrie Lam has defended the territory as an attractive place for businesses after a recent survey found foreigners were considering leaving. A survey by the American Chamber of Commerce in Hong Kong this month found 42% of expatriates polled were planning or considering leaving the city. They cited a new national security law, strict COVID-19 quarantines, and concerns about education, given Hong Kong's changing political situation. Ms. Lam says the city hasn't seen significant outflow of capital, and the securities markets and banking sector are doing well. The owner of a British Columbia Airbnb property catering to fans of Lord of the Rings has been forced to change its name. Christina Lecomte bought the Hobbit mountain hole last year. She alleges Warner Brothers reached out last week, threatening to launch a lawsuit if she didn't change the name. The property has now been renamed to the Second Breakfast Hideaway, a nod to a Hobbit's love of meals. Ms. Lecomte says the property is popular not only with fans of the films and books, but also people who want to escape from the stress of day-to-day life. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. Remember, for more news on demand, you could always visit our website, thenewsforum.ca, and be sure to follow us on our social media handles on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can also watch all of our commentary programming on the News Forum YouTube channel. All right, thank you for joining us on the Forum Daily, everyone, and we'll see you again next time. Bye for now.